In the shadowed crook of the Pennine foothills, where the moorland breathes fog into the valleys and time seems to thicken like curdled milk, stood the hamlet of Crowhaven. Less a village than a clutch of stone cottages huddled around a single cobbled lane, their slate roofs slick with moss and their chimneys perpetually whispering smoke into the low sky. It was the sort of place forgotten by maps, known only to drovers and the odd surveyor who passed through in late autumn, chilled by more than the wind. The forge, however, was never forgotten. It anchored the settlement like a blackened tooth in an otherwise unremarkable jawline of hills. Crowhaven Forge had stood since the reign of Queen Anne, its stone walls thick with soot, its hearth never truly cold. By the mid-19th century, it belonged to one Silas Thorne, a man whose name carried the weight of iron and silence in equal measure. He was neither young nor old when first noted in the parish records of 1843, simply present, as though he'd always been there, hammer in hand, eyes fixed on the flame. Villagers spoke little of him, not out of fear so much as a kind of weary deference. He mended ploughshares, reforged hinges, cast bells for sheep collars, and sometimes, though never on request, crafted small exquisite objects. A snuff-box with filigree hinges, a pair of candlesticks with bases shaped like coiled serpents, a music box that played a faint warped melody no one could place. These pieces appeared without explanation on doorsteps or in market stalls, unsigned, unpaid for, accepted with uneasy gratitude. Silas Thorne lived alone. His wife, Eliza, had died in childbirth 2 decades prior, and the child with her, neither mourned nor named in the register, only recorded as stillborn female. After that, Thorne withdrew from Sunday service, declined invitations to harvest suppers, and ceased attending the annual Whit Monday fairs. Yet he remained indispensable. When the mill wheel axle cracked in 47, it was Thorne who reforged it in 3 days without rest. When young Thomas Hargrave broke his leg, chasing a stray ewe over Blackshaw Edge, it was Thorne who fashioned a splint from polished steel lined with felt that held the bone steady until the bone setter arrived from Cayley. He asked for nothing in return, not coin, not thanks, not even a nod beyond what custom demanded. But whispers began, as they always do in tight places. Mrs. Bickley, the postmistress, claimed she once saw him at dawn, crouched by the riverbank with a burlap sack, its contents heavy and oddly shaped, dragging grooves in the dew-wet grass. Old man Crawley swore the forge chimneys sometimes smoked at midnight, though no fire could be seen through the slitted windows. And on certain windless nights, a low rhythmic clinking echoed from within, an odd sound, not the usual clang of hammer on iron, but something softer, almost like bone tapping bone. The first disappearance went largely unnoticed. It was only James Weller, a vagrant who sometimes slept in the hayloft above the livery stable, and he hadn't been seen for a week before anyone remarked upon it. "Gone to Leeds," someone said, or Bradford. But then came Martha Ellaby, a spinster who sold herbs and mended socks for the miners' wives. She vanished one Tuesday after delivering tansy tea to the vicar's wife. Her shawl was found draped over the stone wall near the old quarry, neatly folded, as though laid aside for a moment's rest. No one thought to connect her absence to the forge. Not then, but the village grew quieter. Children were called indoors earlier, doors were bolted though no storms threatened. And still, the forge worked. On the morning after Martha's shawl was discovered, Thorne was seen drawing water from the well, his face unreadable, his hands always clean, always steady, bearing faint white smudges like chalk dust or ash. Then came the bell. Not a church bell, nor sheep bell, but a small handheld thing no larger than a walnut, cast in a dark metal that caught no reflection. It appeared on the vicarage step one November morning, tied with twine. The vicar's daughter, just 8 years old, picked it up and rang it once. The sound was wrong, not sharp, not dulled, but hollow, as though echoing from deep underground. She dropped it, crying, though she could not say why. The vicar, a rational man of Enlightenment leanings, dismissed it as a prank, but that night his wife woke to the same sound, faint, metallic, coming from the garden. When she looked out, the bell was gone. The following week, the vicar found a page torn from his own diary, tucked beneath the anvil at the forge, a page on which he'd written a private note about Martha Ellaby's disappearance. The handwriting was his, yet the paper smelled of coal smoke and something faintly medicinal, like burnt myrrh. He never confronted Thorne. Instead, he began keeping his own journal locked in a drawer lined with lead, as though afraid the words might escape. It was after the third disappearance, Elias Croft, the schoolmaster, that the pattern became undeniable. Elias had been compiling a census of the parish, meticulous in his notations, and in his ledger, the last entry read, "Thorne, Eston occupation blacksmith, materials used iron, coal, bone." Below it, the ink had blurred, as if dampened by rain or tears. The ledger vanished from the schoolroom the next day. Elias was found 3 miles east, near the river's bend, wearing only his nightshirt, barefoot in November frost, his mouth full of river clay. No signs of struggle, no marks upon him. Only his left hand, clenched tight around a shard of dark metal, so cold it burned the skin of those who pried it loose. The shard bore no markings, yet when held near flame, it released a scent akin to charred hair and dried rosemary. The coroner ruled it melancholy leading to exposure, a verdict accepted with grim resignation. But in the months that followed, more objects began to appear, not just on doorsteps, but in fields, in wells, tucked into the pews of the empty church, a thimble that hummed when touched, a pair of spectacles with lenses of smoky quartz, a comb carved from something pale and porous that snapped under the lightest pressure. Each bore the same peculiar signature, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, as though the thing itself remembered being part of something alive. Crowhaven did not speak of these things openly. Fear, in that time and place, was a private affair, tucked away like a shameful illness. But children stopped playing near the forge. Women crossed the street when Thorne walked to market. And at night, when the wind carried the forge's distant chime through the valley, curtains were drawn tighter, and prayers were whispered not to God, but to older unnamed things. Yet Silas Thorne remained. He worked, he ate, he slept. He never looked up when people avoided his gaze. He only forged. And what he forged, it seemed, required more than iron. The first formal inquiry into the anomalies surrounding Crowhaven Forge came not from the constabulary, overburdened and dismissive, but from a quarterly journal of antiquarian interest, the Northern Chronicle of Obscure Arts, whose editor, a retiring Cambridge man named Alistair Croft, no relation to the schoolmaster, had received an anonymous packet in the winter of 1851. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth stained with what appeared to be tallow or dried marrow, were 3 items: a fragment of parchment inscribed with a cipher resembling alchemical notation, a lock of hair bound with iron wire, and a small iron key whose teeth were worn smooth, as though used countless times yet fitting no known lock. Accompanying these was a single sheet of foolscap, the ink faded to brown, bearing only the words, "He draws the marrow to shape the silence." Croft, though skeptical of folkloric hysteria, was intrigued by the craftsmanship of the key, an alloy unlike any in the Royal Society's metallurgical catalogues, possessing a density and resonance that defied expectation. When struck gently against glass, it emitted a tone so pure it caused nearby candle flames to quiver. He dispatched his most discreet contributor, Edmund Vale, a former assistant to the noted phrenologist Dr. Spurzheim, and now a writer of peculiar repute, to Crowhaven under the pretense of documenting vernacular ironwork for an upcoming supplement. Vale arrived in early spring, when the fields were still spongy with meltwater and the air hung thick with the scent of wet stone and budding hawthorn. He took lodgings at the Red Hart Inn, the village's sole hostelry, and spent his first week observing without intrusion, attending Sunday service, where Thorne's empty pew stood like a missing tooth, walking the perimeter of the forge at dusk, and carefully cataloguing the village's mannerisms. He noted how the blacksmith was never spoken of directly. References were elliptical: the man at the anvil, him down the lane, or simply a gesture toward the forge with averted eyes. Vale's initial interviews yielded little but polite evasions, yet certain details recurred with unsettling consistency. The absence of birds near the forge, the way dogs refused to pass its threshold, the peculiar warmth of its outer walls even in deep frost. More significantly, several informants recalled that Thorne never purchased coal. The forge burned day and night, yet no coal merchant's cart had stopped in Crowhaven for years. Instead, an elderly charcoal burner named Josiah Pike confessed, after 3 pints and much coaxing, that Thorne occasionally brought him bundles of oddwood, dry and dense, which burned without smoke and left behind ash that glittered faintly in moonlight. When pressed, Pike grew agitated, muttering about sap that sings and refusing further discourse. Vale's breakthrough came not from people, but from paper. In the vestry chest of St. Cuthbert's, buried beneath baptismal registers and tithe records, he discovered a slim ledger belonging to the previous vicar, one Reverend Horace Pembroke, who had died suddenly in 1839, officially of apoplexy, though parish gossip hinted at a fall down the church tower stairs. The ledger contained meticulous notes on local trades, including entries on Thorne's early commissions. Most were mundane: horseshoes, hinges, scythes. But one passage, dated All Souls' Day 1837, chilled Vale to the bone. Thorne delivered a reliquary for Lady Ashcombe's private devotion. Grafted of white iron, he called it. When I asked its source, he replied, "From what remains when the soul departs, but the shape endures." Lady A wept upon receiving it, though whether from grief or wonder I cannot say. Beneath this, Pembroke had added in a shakier hand, "Observed Thorne at midnight in the churchyard." Not digging, listening. This discovery led Vale to Ashcombe Hall, 10 miles distant, where the Dowager Lady Eleanor Ashcombe still resided in genteel seclusion. She received him in a drawing-room draped in mourning crepe, her fingers tracing the rim of a small lidded casket resting on a velvet cushion. She did not open it. "It holds the echo of my son," she said softly, referring to her only child, lost to consumption in 1836 at age 19. She claimed Thorne had appeared unbidden at her gate one fog-laden morning, offering to bind his voice in metal so it might not scatter. Inside the casket, she explained, was a tiny tuning fork. When struck near her ear, it resonated with a pitch identical to her son's speaking voice, not the words, mind you, but the very timbre, the breath behind them. She had not used it in years, yet kept it close, for fear the silence might grow too complete. Vale, trained in acoustics, examined the fork under magnification. Its prongs bore microscopic striations that matched no known forging technique, and its base was inlaid with a sliver of material resembling human dentine. Lady Ashcombe refused to surrender it and begged him to cease his inquiry. "Some silences," she whispered, "are mercies." Returning to Crowhaven, Vale's demeanor shifted. He grew restless, pale, prone to waking in the night, convinced he heard the faint chime of Thorne's anomalous bell. He began noting patterns others had missed. The dates of disappearances aligned with phases of the moon, specifically the dark of it. Each vanished villager had, in the weeks prior, commissioned or received a small forged object from Thorne. And crucially, none left behind personal effects. Their clothing, letters, even toothbrushes vanished with them. Vale interviewed the vicar's wife again, who now confessed that the page torn from the diary had not merely been found under the anvil. It had been fused to it, as though pressed into molten metal and cooled. Vale sought permission to examine the forge interior. Thorne, without a word, unlocked the heavy oak door and stood aside. Inside, the air was still and warm, smelling of ozone and dried herbs. The hearth was cold. Tools hung in perfect order. But in the corner, beneath a tarpaulin, Vale glimpsed a workbench lined with shallow trays containing fragments, ivory-colored, jointed, unmistakably osseous. Thorne said nothing. He merely watched as Vale stepped back, his breath shallow, his scholarly composure fracturing. That evening, Vale wrote in his journal, "He does not kill to forge. He forges to preserve what death unmoors. But preservation requires substitution, and the village pays the balance." Vale's journal, recovered years later from a locked compartment in his writing desk, reveals a mind gradually unspooling under the weight of what he could not disprove. He ceased filing reports to the Northern Chronicle. Instead, he filled page after page with sketches of bone fragments, metacarpals, phalanges, cranial shards, each annotated with speculative functions. Tuned for resonance, hollowed for breath passage, fused with iron to retain memory. He became convinced Thorne was not merely recycling the dead, but reconstituting them, not into bodies, but into objects that carried the essence of who they had been, voice, gesture, even sorrow, distilled into form and tone. Vale noted that every artifact attributed to Thorne responded to specific stimuli. The music box played only when held by someone who had known its source. The snuff box released a scent identical to the pipe tobacco favored by old Josiah Pike, who vanished in '49. The comb, when drawn through a woman's hair, caused her to hum a lullaby her mother had sung, a mother long buried, whose bones, Vale suspected, now formed part of the comb's delicate teeth. These were not hauntings in the spectral sense, but transferences, consciousness not lingering, but relocated, imprisoned in iron and bone. His investigations grew more obsessive. He corresponded with anatomists in Edinburgh and metallurgists in Sheffield, sending coded descriptions of the alloys Thorne used. One reply from a Dr. Linley at the Royal College of Surgeons chilled him. "The density and crystalline structure you describe align with no known mineral combination. However, if we hypothesize a matrix wherein calcified human tissue is reduced to powder, then sintered under extreme heat with wrought iron and something organic, perhaps marrow fat as a flux, the resulting compound might exhibit anomalous acoustic properties. Such a process would require intimate knowledge of both osteology and smelting, and a profound disregard for the sanctity of the dead." Vale burned the letter but remembered every word. He began visiting the churchyard at night, measuring distances between graves and noting which headstones bore recent scratches, thin, deliberate gouges, as though someone had scraped them with a metal stylus. He discovered that each of the vanished had graves, or rather memorial stones, for bodies were never recovered, that showed signs of being sampled. Then came the rain. A relentless downpour in the autumn of 1852 turned the lane to mud and flooded the cellar of the Red Hart, where Vale stored his notes. In salvaging them, he found something unexpected tucked inside the false back of his traveling case, a narrow iron rod, no longer than his forearm, wrapped in waxed linen. He had no memory of acquiring it. Yet when he held it, a profound sense of calm washed over him, followed instantly by a disorienting wave of grief so personal it brought him to his knees. Later, in trembling script, he wrote, "It is mine or will be. He has begun to prepare my vessel." From that moment, Vale stopped sleeping. He took to pacing the lanes at all hours, convinced he heard footsteps matching his own a half-second late. He noted in his journal that his reflection in windows sometimes lingered a moment too long after he had passed. And once, returning from the forge at twilight, he found his inkwell filled not with ink, but with a viscous black fluid that smelled of burnt bone and dried tears. He did not drink it, but he kept it. The villagers, sensing his unraveling, avoided him entirely. Even the innkeeper's wife left his meals on a tray outside his door. Only the vicar, now aged and stooped, dared speak with him. Over weak tea in the rectory study, The man confessed that Thorne had once brought him a pair of candlesticks after his wife's death, so that her light might not go out, the blacksmith had said. The vicar had used them only once. The flame, though steady, cast no heat, and in its glow he swore he saw his wife's hands, not as they were in life, but as they might have been in death, translucent, cold, shaping the air as though moulding silence. He never lit them again. He means no malice, the vicar murmured, but meaning is irrelevant when the method defiles the soul's departure. Vale asked if Thorne ever spoke of his own wife, Eliza. The vicar hesitated, then said, "Only once. He told me she did not wish to be forgotten, so he kept her close." Vale left the rectory shaken. That night he sketched the interior of the forge from memory and, in the margin, wrote, "The anvil is her altar, the hammer his prayer." He began watching the forge not by day, but by the dark of the moon. Hidden in the copse of yew trees across the lane, he observed Thorne's nocturnal rituals. The blacksmith never stoked a fire. Instead, he arranged bones on the anvil, cleaned, polished, sometimes strung like beads on iron wire, and struck them not with the hammer's flat face, but with its peen, a precise, almost surgical tap. Each strike produced a note, faint but clear, and Thorne would pause, listening before selecting another fragment. It was not forging as industry, but as composition. Vale recorded in hushed prose, "He is not making things. He is tuning them, like an organist preparing a requiem from the very ribs of the choir." One such night, Thorne paused mid-task, turned toward the yews, and stared directly at Vale's hiding place. He did not call out. He simply held up a small, curved piece of bone, perhaps a rib, and struck it once. The sound that followed was not musical. It was a sigh. Vale fled, certain he had heard his own name in that exhalation. By the winter of 1853, Edmund Vale had become less a chronicler than a revenant haunting the margins of Crowhaven. His clothes hung loose, his eyes burned with a feverish glaze, and his once elegant script had devolved into a spidery scrawl that crowded the margins of every available surface. His coat lining, the walls of his room at the Red Hart, even the inside of his hat. He no longer sought evidence. He sought communion. Local accounts from that period describe him standing for hours outside the forge, not watching, but waiting, as though expecting an invitation that never came. The villagers, now thoroughly unnerved, petitioned the magistrate in Skipton, but without bodies, without confessions, without even a clear crime, the law could do nothing. "Men are free to lose their wits," the magistrate wrote in his log, "so long as they do not disturb the peace." And Vale, for all his unravelling, remained disturbingly quiet. Yet in London, his earlier notes, those dispatched before his descent, had not gone unread. A young archivist at the British Museum named Clara Winslow, tasked with cataloguing submissions to the Northern Chronicle, had been struck by Vale's initial sketches of Thorne's artifacts. Something in their symmetry, their uncanny adaptation of organic form to function, reminded her of a forgotten manuscript in the museum's esoteric collection, De Ferro Animato, a 17th-century treatise attributed to a disgraced alchemist monk named Brother Cuthbert of Glastonbury. The text, long dismissed as heretical fantasy, described a method of soul-binding through metallurgical transmutation wherein the essence of a person could be preserved in iron, if fused with their own calcined remains. During a specific lunar conjunction, the process required not murder but consent, implied or explicit, at the moment of death. Clara, whose father had been a surgeon and whose childhood had been steeped in anatomical curiosity, found herself unable to dismiss the parallels. She wrote to the editor of the Chronicle, requesting all of Vale's correspondence. What she received unsettled her deeply. The later entries read like the ravings of a man, not going mad, but being unmade. Against the advice of her superiors, Clara travelled to Crowhaven in early spring of 1854. Posing as a folklorist collecting regional ballads, she found Vale in the Red Hart's attic room, surrounded by diagrams linking bone structure to harmonic frequencies and iron alloys to emotional resonance. He barely recognized her. When she mentioned De Ferro Animato, however, his eyes cleared for a moment. "You've read it," he whispered, not as a question but as an accusation. He showed her a final entry in his journal, a single line repeated dozens of times. "He does not take the dead. He answers their plea," Clara pressed him. "Who pleaded? The vanished, or someone else?" Vale would say no more, but he gave her a key, the same one Croft had received years prior, and told her to listen where the walls remember. That night, Clara walked to the forge. Thorne was absent, the door slightly ajar. Inside, she found not a workshop, but a sanctuary of silence. Shelves lined the walls, each holding small objects, a spindle whorl, a locket, a pocket watch with no hands. When she touched the locket, it grew warm. When she held the spindle, she heard, faintly, a woman singing a weaving song in a dialect long extinct in the region. She placed the key on the anvil. It hummed. Clara returned to London with more than notes. She carried fragments, metaphysical, not physical, of what she had witnessed. She cross-referenced parish records, burial logs, and census data, discovering that Crowhaven's death rate in the decades before Thorne's arrival had been abnormally high, particularly among women in childbirth and the elderly. Many died alone without kin, their names unremembered. Thorne's wife, Eliza, had been one such. But Clara found something else, a marginal note in the 1829 burial register, in a different hand, stating that Eliza Thorne had been interred without coffin, by her husband's request, wrapped in iron cloth. No such fabric existed, unless it was metaphor or method. Clara tracked down surviving relatives of the vanished and discovered a common thread. Each had expressed, in private letters or witnessed conversations, a fear of being forgotten. Martha Ellerby had written to her sister, "When I'm gone, who'll recall the taste of my chamomile tea?" Elias Croft had lamented in his school log, "Names fade faster than ink." James Weller, the vagrant, had once told the innkeeper, "I've no one to say I was here." Not even a stone. Clara began to understand. Thorne was not a murderer. He was a custodian, a craftsman of memory. In a world where the poor vanished without epitaphs, where grief had no vessel, he offered preservation, not in earth, but in iron and bone. Yet preservation demanded material, and someone had to provide it. Clara wrote a monograph, not for publication, but for the museum's sealed archive. In it, she theorized that Thorne's process required proximity at the moment of death, a final breath exhaled over heated bone, a whispered name as the soul departed. But the disappeared had not died in their beds, unless they had gone willingly, drawn by rumor, by despair, by the promise of endurance. Clara never proved it. But in her final entry she wrote, "Perhaps the true horror is not that he forged the dead, but that they asked to be forged." She sealed the monograph with red wax and inscribed on the cover, "Let silence keep what speech cannot bear." The forge fell silent, not with a crash, but with the slow surrender of a breath held too long. By the autumn of 1856, the rhythmic clang that had once marked time for all of Crowhaven, the steady pulse of hammer on anvil, had dwindled to sporadic taps, then to nothing at all. Villagers noted the change not in words, but in the way they paused on the lane at dusk, ears straining for a sound that no longer came. Smoke no longer curled from the chimney, even when frost silvered the rooftops and the wind howled down from the moors. Silas Thorne, once as constant as the stone walls of his workshop, became a ghost before his body failed him. He was glimpsed only once in those final weeks, standing at the edge of the churchyard at dawn, staring not at the graves, but at the bare earth between them, as though reading names written in root and worm. When he did not appear for the Michaelmas gathering, an event he had never attended, yet whose absence was always noted, the vicar, now frail and half-blind, sent young Peter Hemsley to the forge with a loaf of bread and a jar of preserves. The boy returned pale, the offerings untouched. "Doors open," he whispered, "but it feels watched." The vicar, leaning heavily on his cane, made the slow journey himself. Inside, all was unnervingly orderly. Tools hung in precise alignment. The bellows lay folded like folded hands. Ash had been swept into a neat pile in the corner, though no fire had burned in weeks. And on the anvil, cold, dark, unblemished, rested a single object, a small iron bell, its surface dulled by time, but cool to the touch. The vicar did not ring it. He sensed with the instinct of a man who had spent his life listening for the voice of God in silence that this bell answered to a different summons. He closed the door softly behind him and never returned. Thorne was found 3 weeks later in his chair by the hearth, upright, eyes open, hands resting, palms up on his knees, as though expecting to receive something or to offer it. There was no expression on his face, neither peace nor pain, only an absence so complete it seemed deliberate. The coroner, summoned from Skipton, declared the cause natural dissolution of the faculties, a phrase as vague as it was final. No autopsy was performed. Such scrutiny was deemed unnecessary for a man of his age and solitude. He was buried beside Eliza in the far corner of St. Cuthbert's churchyard, beneath a yew whose roots, it was said, drank deeper than any other. His grave bore no marker, save a simple iron post driven into the earth, the same dark metal he had worked for 40 years, its top smoothed by rain and time until it gleamed like bone in moonlight. His will, discovered folded inside a hollowed copy of the Book of Common Prayer on his writing desk, contained only 2 sentences: "Let the forge stand as it is. It belongs now to those who listen." Legally, the directive meant nothing. The property reverted to the parish, but no tenant would take it. No buyer would name a price. Offers came from ironmongers in Leeds, from collectors of curiosities in London, even from a spiritualist society convinced the site held resonant energies. All were refused. Not by the parish, but by an unspoken consensus among the villagers. The forge remained sealed, its windows boarded, its door barred with iron nails hammered deep. Yet on certain nights, always still, always when the moon was swallowed by cloud, those who passed too close reported hearing it. A single, pure chime, followed by the soft, dry rattle of something shifting within, like teeth clicking in the dark. Clara Winslow never returned to Crowhaven. She lived out her days among the hushed corridors of the British Museum, rising to become keeper of manuscripts, though she never again touched texts concerning the occult or the anomalous. Her monograph on Thorne remained locked in a lead-lined drawer, unread, unacknowledged. But in her private journal, bound in black calf and kept beneath her pillow until her death in 1891, she wrote a single entry decades later that read, "Last night I dreamt I stood once more in that forge, not as I was, curious, skeptical, but as I might have been willing. The anvil held not iron, but my own hands, already cool, already shaped." Thorne did not look at me. He simply placed the hammer in my palm and stepped aside. I understood then that he was not the craftsman, but the vessel. The real forge was grief, and we all feed it, she added in a hand grown shaky with age. "Sometimes when the house is empty and the clock has stopped, I hear a bell. It does not call me. It remembers me. The forge stood abandoned for nearly 50 years, a blackened tooth in the village's jawline, avoided by children and spoken of only in lowered tones. When the railway came through in 1903, swallowing fields and cottages alike, the parish council deemed the structure a hazard and ordered its demolition. The workmen who arrived with crowbars and sledgehammers were hardened men, used to rot and ruin, yet all later admitted to an unease they could not name. The walls, though only 2 feet thick, resisted collapse as though fused with something denser than stone. When they finally broke through the hearth, they found not ash or char, but a fine white powder interlaced with iron filings, so tightly compacted it crumbled only under extreme pressure. A local physician, curious, took a sample. Under magnification, the powder revealed microscopic structures resembling sintered bone and calcified marrow, fused with traces of an unknown metallic alloy that defied chemical analysis. The powder was buried with the rubble in a pit far from the village well. But one man, Thomas Harrow, a quiet labourer with a limp from the Boer War, pocketed a small object he found beneath a loose flagstone, an iron bell, no larger than a walnut, cold to the touch, its surface etched with faint spirals that seemed to shift in low light. He gave it to his daughter on her wedding day as a charm against sorrow. She kept it on her dressing table for 60 years. Her grandchildren would later recall that on still nights, when the house stood empty and the wind held its breath, the bell would sometimes ring once, though no hand had touched it. No air had stirred. Crowhaven itself faded, swallowed by time and progress. The cottages were razed, the lane paved over, the church abandoned and eventually repurposed as a storage barn for tractors and feed sacks. Only the churchyard remains, its headstones leaning like weary sentinels, names worn smooth by rain. Tourists passing through on country drives rarely stop, but those who do, especially at twilight, when mist rises from the river and the yews cast long shadows, sometimes report a peculiar warmth near the unmarked grave in the far corner, and a silence so deep it hums. And if one stands very still, listening not with the ears, but with the hollow places inside, one might hear it, the faint, patient tap of a hammer shaping something that was and will not be forgotten, not while iron holds memory and bone remembers song.